Eleanor Whitmore had always believed that land was more than just dirt beneath one's feet. It was history, it was identity, it was family, and it was something you never abandoned, no matter how many people tried to tell you otherwise. At 93 years old, she had spent nearly 7 decades on her small patch of earth, tending to its soil with the same love and devotion that she had once given to her late husband, Henry, and their children, who had all long since left for their own lives in places far from here. This farm wasn't just a house or a collection of fields. It was a living memory, a place where laughter had echoed through the walls, where she had stitched patches onto her son's overalls, where she had nursed Henry through his final days and buried him beneath the grand oak tree that now stood as a silent guardian over her land. The thought of leaving was unthinkable. Yet, for the past few months, it seemed as though the world was trying to force her to do exactly that. First, it had been the letters, official-looking documents typed up in cold, impersonal font, notifying her that her property was of considerable interest to a powerful land development firm that had already bought out nearly every neighboring farm. The offers they made were generous, too generous, and she knew from experience that whenever a deal seemed too good to be true, it almost always came with strings attached. She had ignored them at first, but then the visits had started. The first time, it was just a man in a suit, smooth-talking and confident, stepping onto her front porch with a well-rehearsed smile and a folder full of contracts. "Mrs. Whitmore," he had said, as if they were old friends, "we'd love to make this transition as easy as possible for you. We understand that this farm has sentimental value, and that's why we're offering you 3 times what it's worth." He spoke in a way that might have been persuasive to someone younger, someone who hadn't seen every kind of swindler in the book. Eleanor had simply rocked in her chair, her sharp gray eyes never leaving his face, and said, "If you understood anything about this farm, son, you'd know it isn't for sale." His smile had faltered just slightly before he folded up his folder and left, but she could tell by the way his hands clenched as he walked back to his car that this wasn't the last time she'd be seeing him. And she had been right. The next time, he hadn't come alone. A different man had stepped out of the car with him. This one younger, rougher around the edges, with a face that carried no charm and a voice that had no patience for pleasantries. He hadn't offered her a handshake, hadn't bothered with paperwork. Instead, he had stood on her porch and said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be, lady." That was when she knew things were changing. Then came the damages. At first, it had been small things. Her mailbox, smashed in the dead of night. Her water pump, mysteriously broken. But then it had escalated. She had woken one morning to find her garden trampled, her vegetable rows flattened by boot prints. Another night, she smelled something strange and discovered that someone had poured oil along her wooden porch, a silent threat that if she didn't reconsider, the next time it might not just be oil, they might bring the match. Eleanor had gone to the sheriff, of course, but Sheriff Calloway had been less than helpful, shifting uncomfortably in his chair as he told her that maybe, just maybe, she ought to think about what's best for her at her age. It had been a long time since she had felt the sting of true helplessness, but in that moment, she had realized that whatever was happening wasn't just some business deal. It was a message. Still, she had held firm. She had sat on her porch every evening, her shotgun resting beside her, waiting, watching. But the men never came close enough for a direct confrontation. They were circling, like vultures, waiting for her to be too weak, too tired, too broken to fight back anymore. And the truth was, she was tired. Not just physically, though her bones ached more than they ever had before, but emotionally, spiritually. Henry was gone. Her children had their own lives. She was alone, fighting a battle that no one else seemed willing to fight. And then, one night, the fear crept in. It was late, too late, and she had been sitting by the window when she heard it. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving across her front yard. She had reached for her shotgun, her hands trembling as she cocked it, but the footsteps didn't stop. Instead, There was a slow, deliberate knocking at her door. 3 taps. Then silence. She had frozen, her breath hitching in her throat, before she forced herself to move forward, peering through the peephole. But there had been nothing there, just the wind blowing across the empty fields. And that was when she knew. She couldn't do this alone anymore. As much as it pained her, as much as her pride screamed against it, she knew she had no choice. Her hands shook as she reached for the old phone book on the counter, her fingers tracing over names she hadn't thought about in years. And then she saw it, his name, Jason Whitmore, her grandson. She hesitated. It had been years since they had spoken. He had left home young, joined the Navy, became something she barely understood. A SEAL, they had said. And then, just as suddenly, he had left the military and disappeared into the world, barely keeping in touch, barely answering the few letters she had sent. She had seen him once a long time ago when he had returned from deployment, and there had been something in his eyes that scared her, a distance, a coldness, as if he had seen things that had stripped away something human inside of him. But right now, she didn't care about any of that. Right now, she just needed him to come home. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. And just as she thought he wouldn't answer, just as she prepared to hang up and accept that she was truly on her own, his voice came through, deep, tired, and unfamiliar. Hello. Eleanor swallowed, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried everything. Years of distance, of regret, of love, of desperation. Jason, she said, her breath shaky. I need you to come home. Jason hadn't been back to his grandmother's farm in over 15 years, and when he finally pulled onto the long, winding dirt road leading to the house, the sight of it hit him harder than he had expected. The farmhouse, once a proud white structure with a wraparound porch and flower beds bursting with color, looked tired, as if it had been fighting to stand against the weight of time and losing. The paint was peeling, the wooden steps sagging, and the field that had once been Henry Whitmore's pride and joy, were now overgrown, patches of wild grass creeping into what should have been neatly tilled rows of soil. But it wasn't just the decay that struck him. It was the feeling in the air, something dark, something wrong. He had spent years in war zones, and this place, his grandmother's home, gave him the same uneasy feeling he had felt before walking into an ambush. The first thing he noticed was the bullet hole in the mailbox. It wasn't fresh. Rust had already begun to creep along the jagged edges, but it was a message clear as day. Someone had wanted to remind Eleanor that she was being watched. He parked his truck in the driveway and stepped out, scanning the perimeter with the same quiet efficiency that had once been second nature to him. There were other signs, little things that an untrained eye might have missed. The front door had scuff marks near the handle, like someone had tried to force it open. The chicken coop door was torn off its hinges, the remains of a few dead birds still scattered in the dirt. And then there was the fence, sawed through in multiple places, the wood splintered as if someone had been making small, patient attempts to weaken the structure over time. This wasn't vandalism. This was intimidation. Eleanor was waiting for him on the porch, sitting in her rocking chair like she always had, but as he stepped closer, he could see how much she had aged since the last time he saw her. Her once strong, steady hands trembled slightly as she reached for her cane, and though she tried to straighten her spine, he could see the weight she carried in her frail shoulders. But her eyes, her sharp, unwavering eyes, were the same. She had always been a tough woman, and even now, even as fear lurked just beneath the surface, she wasn't going to show it. You look like hell, she said, her voice dry, but there was a flicker of relief in it. Jason gave a small smirk. So do you, Grandma? She scoffed but didn't argue. Instead, she gestured for him to sit, and as soon as he did, the words spilled out. She told him everything. About the letters, the threats, the men who had started showing up at all hours of the night. About the sheriff's uselessness, the damage to her property, and the awful, gnawing feeling that she was being toyed with, like cat batting around a mouse before going in for the kill. Jason listened in silence, his jaw clenching tighter with every detail. By the time she finished, his hands were curled into fists. "This isn't just some company pushing for a sale," he said finally, his voice low, measured. "This is something else." Eleanor exhaled. "I know." Jason ran a hand over his face, thinking. This wasn't the kind of situation where he could just make a few calls and expect the problem to go away. Whoever was behind this had the town under their thumb, and if the sheriff was looking the other way, it meant these men had power, real power. The kind that didn't just operate through legal threats, but through fear, violence, and the certainty that no one would dare to stop them. And they weren't just trying to scare Eleanor. They were waiting for her to be too afraid to fight back. "Have they hurt you?" Jason asked, his voice tight. "Not yet," she said, "but they're getting bolder. Last night I heard someone outside. I think they were on the porch." Jason's expression darkened. "Did you see them?" "No," she admitted, "but I found footprints in the morning." "And this?" She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Jason took it from her, smoothing it out. There was only one sentence, written in rough, scrawled handwriting. "Leave now before we make you leave." His grip on the paper tightened, and something cold and familiar settled in his chest. He had seen this kind of thing before, back in places where the rules didn't matter, where men took what they wanted because they knew no one could stop them. He looked up at Eleanor. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She sighed, shaking her head. "Because I didn't want you getting involved in this mess." Jason let out a short, humorless laugh. "Too late?" That night, he stayed up watching. He positioned himself near the window, just out of sight, his trained eyes scanning the property. The shotgun Eleanor kept by the door was old, barely functional, but it was clear she had been sleeping with it nearby. The thought of her sitting here, alone night after night, waiting for these bastards to make their move, made something burn in Jason's chest. He hadn't felt this kind of rage in years. Not since he had left the SEALs. Not since he had told himself he was done fighting battles that couldn't be won. But this was different. This was family. The first sign of movement came just past midnight. A flicker of motion near the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. Jason's pulse slowed, his focus sharpening. He moved quietly to the door, stepping out onto the porch without making a sound. The air was thick with silence, the kind that carried hidden danger. He took another step forward, his boots crunching softly against the wooden planks. And then a shadow shifted. Jason's instincts took over. He lunged forward, grabbing the intruder by the collar and slamming him against the porch railing before the man could react. There was a grunt of pain, followed by a wild struggle, but Jason was stronger, faster. He pinned the man down, his knee pressing against his back as he finally got a look at him. Young, maybe in his early 20s, dressed in dark clothes, reeking of cheap beer and sweat. Not the ringleader, just a pawn. "Who sent you?" Jason demanded, his voice dangerously low. The man coughed, struggling. "I don't know, man. I was just told to." Jason applied more pressure. "To what?" The man groaned. "To scare the old lady. That's it, I swear." Jason leaned in close, his grip tightening. "Listen to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You go back to whoever sent you and tell them that the game is over. Tell them this farm is protected now." The man hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. "And if I see you here again," Jason continued, his voice like steel, "you won't be walking away next time." With that, he let go. The man scrambled to his feet, gasping, before running off into the night. Jason watched until he disappeared, then turned back to the house. Eleanor was standing in the doorway, watching him. "Well," she said after a long moment, "I guess it's good you came home after all." Jason exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Yeah," he muttered. "Guess it is." But as he looked out into the darkness, he knew this was only the beginning. Jason had been in fights before, plenty of them. Some in uniform, some in places so far removed from civilization that the rules no longer mattered. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield, wasn't an enemy he could take down with precision strikes or a well-planned assault. This was something worse, something insidious, something that slithered through the cracks of small-town corruption, something that didn't need bullets to kill because it knew fear was often more effective. He could feel it wrapping itself around Eleanor's farm like a slow, patient snake, waiting for the moment she slipped, waiting for her to break out of the weight of intimidation and exhaustion. And he wasn't going to let that happen. After sending the intruder running back into the night with a warning he hoped would rattle whoever was calling the shots, Jason hadn't gone back inside to sleep. Instead, he spent the rest of the night walking the perimeter of the property, eyes sharp, muscles coiled, every nerve on edge. He was running on old instincts now, the same ones that had kept him alive overseas, the same ones that had turned him into a ghost in the field, always watching, always listening, always one step ahead. But by the time the sun cracked over the horizon, bathing the fields in a soft golden glow, something gnawed at him, something deeper than just anger or the itch of unfinished business. This was bigger than Eleanor, bigger than one old woman refusing to sell her farm. And if he was going to stand against it, if he was going to fight back, he couldn't do it alone. Eleanor was already up when he stepped inside, a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the old stovetop. She didn't look surprised to see him still dressed, still carrying that hard, restless energy that meant he hadn't slept. Instead, she just poured him a cup and set it on the table. "You got that look," she said simply, sitting down across from him. Jason took the cup, sipping the coffee that was somehow both scalding and weak, a taste so familiar it almost made his chest tighten. "What look?" "The look Henry used to get when something was weighing on him," she said, tapping her fingers lightly against the rim of her cup. The kind of look that meant he was about to do something reckless. Jason huffed a quiet laugh. "Sound about right." Eleanor studied him, her gaze sharp despite the wrinkles of age softening her face. "What's the plan, then?" That was the question, wasn't it? He could sit here night after night, waiting for the next goon to crawl out of the shadows, but that wouldn't stop the bigger machine grinding its gears behind the scenes. Whoever these men were, they weren't just going to back down because of a single warning. They weren't afraid of Eleanor. They weren't afraid of the law. But maybe, just maybe, he could give them something to fear. "I need to know who we're dealing with," Jason said finally, setting his cup down with a soft clink against the table. "Not just the hired muscle. I need to know who's pulling the strings." Eleanor's mouth pressed into a thin line. "You're thinking of going into town?" Jason nodded. "I need to talk to some people. And I need to make a call." She sighed, staring down at her coffee. "This isn't a war, Jason." He gave her a look. "Feels like one." She didn't argue. By noon, Jason was driving down the narrow road toward town, the old pickup truck rattling beneath him. He had spent his childhood in this place, running through these streets, sneaking into the general store for candy, chasing fireflies with kids whose faces he could barely remember now. But as he drove past the familiar buildings, the diner, the hardware store, the rusted-out gas station that had been there longer than he had been alive, he could feel something was off. People weren't just going about their day. They were watching. Heads turned as he passed, eyes flickering toward him with something between curiosity and hesitation. They knew. They knew what was happening to Eleanor. They knew who was behind it. and they were too scared to do a damn thing about it. Jason pulled up in front of the bar, a rundown place with a flickering neon sign that simply read Frank's. It had been here since before he was born, the kind of place where working men came to drink away their troubles, and where trouble sometimes found them first. As soon as he stepped inside, the scent of stale beer and cigarette smoke hit him, but more than that, he could feel the shift in the air. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Jason walked to the bar, setting his hands on the worn wooden counter. The bartender, a burly man in his 50s with salt and pepper stubble, glanced at him warily. "Been a long time since I saw Whitmore in here," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Jason didn't waste time. "I need a name." The bartender's expression didn't change, but Jason could see it. The flicker of tension, the slight shift in his stance. He knew exactly what Jason was asking. "Don't know what you're talking about," the bartender muttered, pouring a drink he hadn't asked for. Jason leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make sure the words carried weight. "Yeah, you do." A long pause. Then a quiet exhale. "Tom Delaney," the bartender muttered under his breath. "He's the one buying up the land. Big-time developer from out of state. But he ain't the one you should be worried about." Jason frowned. "Then who is?" The bartender hesitated. "His enforcer. Guy named Chet Logan. Runs a crew of locals, boys who got nothing to lose and like throwing their way around. He's the one making sure folks fall in line." Jason nodded slowly, filing the name away. "Where do I find him?" The bartender let out a short, dry laugh. "You don't. He finds you." Jason didn't like that answer. By the time he left the bar, the afternoon sun was burning hot against his skin, but his mind was colder than ever. Chet Logan. He had known men like him before, thugs who thrived on power, on intimidation, on breaking people just because they could. Jason pulled out his phone and dialed the one number he knew could help. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "This better be good," the man on the other end said. "It's Jason," he said simply. "I need a favor." A pause. "Last time you needed a favor, people died." Jason smirked grimly. "Yeah, hoping to keep the body count lower this time." Another pause. Then a sigh. "What's the situation?" Jason looked back at the bar, at the people still watching him from the shadows of their small, fearful town. "I need eyes," he said. "I need intel. And I need to know how deep this goes." The voice on the other end grunted. "Sounds messy." Jason's jaw tightened. "It's personal." A beat of silence. Then, "All right. Sending what I can." Jason hung up. He had a name. He had a target. And now the hunt began. Jason had always believed that coming home would feel different. He had imagined it 100 times in the sleepless nights after deployments, in the quiet moments between firefights, in the spaces where his mind had nowhere to go but back to the place that had once been his world. He had imagined walking through the town, seeing familiar faces, feeling the warmth of memories that had long since faded into the background of his life. But now, as he drove back from the bar with Chet Logan's name burning in his mind, all he felt was a growing sense of unease. The town wasn't the same. Maybe it had never been the peaceful, wholesome place he had convinced himself it was. Or maybe corruption had simply slithered in and taken root while he was gone. Either way, the people who lived here weren't just bystanders, they were prisoners. He could see it in the way they avoided his eyes, in the way their shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow, in the way their conversations died whenever he walked past. They weren't just afraid. They had already lost. By the time he pulled onto Eleanor's property, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows over the farm. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel as he scanned the landscape, checking for anything out of place. The fence had already been repaired. though he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He had left Eleanor inside, telling her to lock the doors while he went into town, but he wasn't sure that would be enough. Locking doors only worked if the enemy respected boundaries, and these men clearly didn't. The engine had barely cut off before the first gunshot rang out. Jason moved before he even had time to think, his body responding on instinct. Dropping low behind the truck as another shot cracked through the air, shattering the driver's side mirror. He inhaled sharply, calculating. The shots weren't coming from the house. They were coming from the tree line, north side of the property. Too far for a pistol, too controlled for a random spray of bullets. A rifle, then. Maybe hunting grade. Probably meant to scare him more than kill him. But he had never been the kind of man who scared easily. Another shot. This one hit the ground just inches from his boot, kicking up dust. Jason didn't hesitate. He darted toward the farmhouse, keeping low, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. Whoever was taking the shots was playing games, toying with him, but Jason had played these kind of games before, and he had never been on the losing side. He reached the porch, his back pressing against the wooden wall, his breathing even despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He could hear movement in the trees now, footsteps crunching against leaves, low voices. 2 men, maybe 3. Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos from inside. Jason. He kept his voice calm. Stay down. Keep the doors locked. More movement. The attackers weren't retreating. They were advancing. Jason's jaw tightened. These weren't just petty criminals looking to scare an old woman. They were trained enough to coordinate an attack, confident enough to do it before nightfall. That meant they weren't afraid of consequences. That meant they thought they were in control. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Jason moved fast, slipping around the side of the house, keeping low as he reached the barn. He knew this land like the back of his hand, knew which spots offered cover, knew how the terrain shifted. The moon was rising now, casting enough light for him to see the first figure moving through the brush, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Jason didn't give him a chance to react. He lunged, striking fast, grabbing the man by the back of his jacket and slamming him into the side of the barn with enough force to rattle his bones. The man gasped, dropping his weapon. Jason pressed his forearm against his throat. Who sent you? The man struggled, but Jason applied more pressure, his voice cold. I asked you a question. Logan, the man stammered, his fingers clawing uselessly at Jason's grip. He just wanted to send a message. Jason narrowed his eyes. You don't send messages with a rifle. The man wheezed. We weren't supposed to kill you. Just rough you up, make you rethink things. Jason gave a humorless chuckle. Bad plan. A noise behind him. Jason moved just in time to avoid the second attacker's swing, a heavy steel pipe whooshing past his head. He released the first man and spun, driving his fist into the second attacker's gut before hooking an elbow into his jaw. The man crumpled to the ground. The first attacker took the opportunity to run. Jason let him. Instead, he grabbed the second attacker by the collar, dragging him toward the porch. He wasn't going to waste time chasing cowards. He had what he needed. He shoved the injured man onto the wooden steps, keeping a firm grip on his shirt. Eleanor had stepped out now, her shotgun in her hands. What the hell is going on? Jason gestured toward the man. Ask him. The attacker groaned, one hand clutching his side. You don't know who you're messing with. Jason grabbed him by the jaw, forcing him to look up. I don't care, he said evenly. But you're going to tell me exactly where to find Chet Logan. The man's lips curled into something between a sneer and a grimace. You're dead, man. You don't even know it yet. Jason sighed. Wrong answer. He slammed the man back against the steps, hard enough to make his teeth clack together. Eleanor, to her credit, didn't even flinch. She just watched, her expression unreadable. Finally, after a long, tense moment, the man coughed and spat blood onto the porch. Okay, he groaned. Logan's got a spot outside town. Runs everything from there. That's all I know. Jason let go, letting the man slump against the steps. Then you'd better get moving. The man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling down the dirt path, disappearing into the night. Jason watched him go, his mind already racing ahead. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Well, she muttered, lowering the shotgun. Guess this means you're staying a little longer. Jason cracked his knuckles. Yeah, he said. Guess it does. But as he looked out over the darkened fields, something inside him told him this wasn't over. Not even close. Jason had met men like Chet Logan before. Arrogant, dangerous men who believed they were untouchable, who mistook fear for power, who thought that just because they had a few hired thugs at their disposal, they were kings of the land. He had fought warlords who ruled through terror, insurgents who controlled villages with violence, crime bosses who thought they could buy or kill their way to invincibility. The mistake they all made was assuming that because most people were afraid of them, everyone would be. But Jason wasn't most people. And he wasn't afraid. The address the thug had given him led to a rundown property on the outskirts of town, a place that had once been a trucking depot before falling into disrepair. Now it was something else entirely, a private compound surrounded by chain-link fencing, the gate flanked by two SUVs that looked more like they belonged to a cartel than a land development company. Security lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Jason counted 3 men stationed outside the gate, all armed. More inside. Good. He wanted them to see him coming. He stepped out of his truck and walked toward the gate, his boots crunching against the gravel. The guards stiffened as he approached, hands moving toward their weapons, but Jason didn't slow down. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't change his pace. He just kept walking until he was close enough to see the confusion flicker across their faces, close enough to see the way their fingers twitched with uncertainty. One of them, a stocky man with a thick beard and a cheap leather jacket, stepped forward. You lost, buddy? Jason tilted his head slightly. Not at all. The man smirked. Then you must be dumber than you look, 'cause this ain't a place you want to be. Jason let out a slow breath. I'm here to see Logan. The second guard, taller and younger, let out a sharp laugh. You think you can just waltz in here and... Jason moved fast. Before the young guard could finish his sentence, Jason grabbed his wrist, twisted sharply, and wrenched the gun from his hand. In the same motion, he drove his elbow into the man's face, sending him sprawling to the ground. The bearded guard reacted too slowly, his hand still halfway to his holster when Jason turned on him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the metal gate with enough force to make it rattle. The third guard reached for his gun, but Jason was already pulling the stolen pistol from the first man's holster, aiming it directly at the center of his forehead. The silence stretched. The bearded man coughed, blinking in shock. Jesus. Open the gate, Jason said. The man hesitated, then nodded frantically to the third guard, who fumbled for his keys, unlocking the chain. The gate swung open. Jason shoved the bearded man aside and stepped through, keeping the gun steady as he walked deeper into the compound. The building was a large warehouse, its windows dark, its doors heavy steel. There were more men inside. Jason could feel them, sense their eyes on him, but none of them moved. Not yet. They were waiting. And then the doors opened. Chet Logan stepped out. Jason had imagined the man to be larger, more imposing. Instead, Logan was lean, sharp-faced, dressed in a crisp black button-down and expensive jeans, like he had just walked out of a high-end nightclub instead of a criminal stronghold. His blonde hair was slicked back, his smile slow and deliberate. He carried himself like a man who had never lost a fight, not because he was tough, but because he had always made sure the fights were rigged in his favor. "Well," Logan drawled, stopping a few feet away. "A Whitmore in the flesh." Jason didn't answer. He just watched, measured, waited. Logan sighed, tilting his head. "You know, I told my boys not to shoot you last night. Thought maybe you'd be smart enough to take the warning and walk away." Jason kept his voice level. "You put a gun on my grandmother's farm." Logan smirked. "You make it sound so personal." Jason took a slow step forward. "That's because it is." The smirk widened. "Cute. But let's be real here. You're one guy. I've got a whole operation. Even if you were half the badass your Navy record says you are, you can't win this fight. Hell, you don't even know what fight you're in." Jason didn't flinch. "Why don't you enlighten me?" Logan sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "See, you think this is about your grandma's farm. It's not. It never was. The land is just leverage. This town, it's already mine. Has been for years. The sheriff's in my pocket. The business owners do what I say. And the farmers? The smart ones took the payout and left. The rest." He shrugged. "They get crushed." Jason's hands curled into fists. "And Eleanor?" Logan chuckled. "She was supposed to fold months ago. Stubborn old woman. Gotta respect that. But now it's about principle. You come into my town, rough up my men, and you think I'd just let that slide?" Jason's expression didn't change. "I think you don't have a choice." Logan laughed outright at that, shaking his head. "You've got balls, I'll give you that. But you're out of your depth, Whitmore." He gestured casually to the men surrounding them. "See, this isn't a fairy tale. This isn't a seal-up. There's no extraction team coming. No backup. Just you, standing in the middle of a whole lot of pissed-off guys with guns." Jason exhaled. "That's supposed to scare me?" Logan grinned. "No. This is." He snapped his fingers. One of his men stepped forward, holding something small, metallic. Jason's stomach turned. It was a bullet. And carved into the casing in tiny, jagged letters was a name. Eleanor. Jason's pulse slowed. His vision sharpened. Logan leaned in slightly, voice quiet. "I don't need to kill you. I just need you to leave. Because if you don't, that bullet finds its mark." Jason didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. And then, finally, he nodded. Logan smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Smart choice." Jason turned and walked back to his truck, his every movement controlled, precise. The moment he reached the driver's seat, he exhaled, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was a countdown. And if Logan wanted a war, Jason would give him one. Jason had always been the type of man who weighed his options before making a move. It was what had kept him alive in the Navy SEALs, what had separated him from the men who made reckless decisions and never came home. But standing outside his grandmother's farmhouse, staring at the bullet with Eleanor's name carved into it, Jason realized that this wasn't the kind of battle that could be won by waiting. Logan had just made it personal. The message had been clear. Leave or Eleanor dies. Jason had spent his life dismantling threats. He had fought men more ruthless than Chet Logan, men who didn't bother with warnings, men who killed first and asked questions later. And every single one of those men had made the same mistake. They had underestimated him. Jason didn't just survive under pressure. He thrived in it. This wasn't just about defending a farm anymore. It was about destroying the men who thought they owned this town. Eleanor was sitting in her rocking chair on the porch when Jason walked up, her shotgun resting across her lap. She had seen that look on his face before, years ago, when he was younger, angrier, carrying wounds no one could see. It was the look of a man who had made up his mind. "Jason," she said softly, gripping the armrests, "tell me what you're thinking." He leaned against the porch railing, rolling the bullet between his fingers. "I'm thinking they need a reminder that this land isn't theirs to take." Eleanor sighed, rubbing a tired hand over her face. "War never solves anything, Jason." He met her gaze, steady, unwavering. "That's because most people fight wars the wrong way." Silence. Eleanor looked down at her shotgun, then back at him. "Whatever you're about to do, you do it knowing there's a line, Jason. A line you don't come back from." Jason exhaled slowly. "I won't kill anyone who doesn't deserve it." She gave him a sad, knowing look. "And who gets to decide that?" Jason didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jason spent the next few hours preparing. He didn't have a team, didn't have the resources he once had in the military. But what he did have was experience. Logan and his men were used to terrorizing farmers, small-town folks who were too scared to fight back. They had never gone up against someone like Jason Whitmore. He scouted the town, moving quietly, unseen. He mapped out the movements of Logan's men, learned where they gathered, where they slept, who their weak links were. He made a stop at an old friend's garage, Ricky Carter, a mechanic who used to sneak him free sodas when he was a kid. Ricky had always kept a low profile, fixing cars and keeping his nose out of trouble. But when Jason walked in and tossed the bullet with Eleanor's name on the counter, Ricky's face hardened. "I'll help," Ricky said. No hesitation. Within hours, Jason had everything he needed: nails scattered on back roads to puncture tires, sugar in gas tanks to ruin engines, phone lines cut to disrupt communication. But it wasn't enough. He needed to send a message. Jason struck at 1:37 a.m. Logan's men had a secondary location, a warehouse near the train tracks, where they stored their weapons, their money, their leverage. It was guarded, but not well. They weren't expecting trouble. They thought they were the trouble. Jason changed that. He slipped in through a back entrance, moving like a shadow, disabling cameras as he went. 2 guards stood by a stack of crates, smoking and laughing. They never saw him coming. Jason struck fast, a sharp elbow to the throat, a knee to the ribs, a precise strike to the temple. The first man crumpled without a sound. The second barely had time to reach for his gun before Jason grabbed him by the collar and slammed his head into the wall. Jason wasn't here to kill. Not yet. He found the storage area, a cache of rifles, stacks of cash, ledgers filled with records of bribes and payoffs. Evidence. Proof that Logan was more than just a thug. He was running a full-scale criminal operation. Jason pulled out a small metal canister, his fingers working quickly. A homemade incendiary device. Within minutes, flames roared through the warehouse, consuming everything. Jason stood outside, watching the fire spread, listening to the distant shouts of Logan's men as they scrambled to contain the destruction. By the time they realized what had happened, Jason was already gone. The next morning, the town woke up to smoke on the horizon. Logan was furious. The warehouse had been his nerve center, and now it was ash. Jason sat on Eleanor's porch, sipping coffee as he watched Logan's men drive by in their black SUVs, their expressions dark, their knuckles white as they gripped their steering wheels. They were looking for him, hunting him. But Jason had taken something from them that they couldn't replace: control. The sheriff showed up around noon, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Jason," he said, clearing his throat, "we need to talk." Jason gestured to the empty chair across from him. Go ahead. The sheriff sat, rubbing his hands together. Logan knows it was you. Jason took another sip of coffee. Good. The sheriff sighed. You don't get it. You're playing with fire. Logan's not just some bully. He's got people backing him. If you don't leave town, things are going to get worse. Jason leaned forward slightly, his eyes cold. For who? The sheriff swallowed. He's got orders, Jason. If you don't leave, he's coming for Eleanor. And this time, he won't be sending a warning. Jason's jaw clenched. He had expected retaliation, but hearing it out loud made his blood run cold. The sheriff hesitated, then leaned in. Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but Logan's planning something big. Tonight, he's sending men to the farm. Jason's stomach tightened. They weren't waiting anymore. This was it. The fight was coming, and Jason was ready. Jason stood on the farmhouse porch, gripping his coffee mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. The sheriff's words still echoed in his head. Tonight, Logan's sending men to the farm. It was the escalation he had expected, the moment he had been preparing for since the second he stepped foot back on this land. But something about the way the sheriff had said it, the way his voice had wavered just slightly, told Jason that this wasn't going to be another scare tactic. Logan had played games long enough. He had threatened, pushed, and now, after Jason had burned his warehouse to the ground, he was done with warnings. He was coming to finish it. And Jason wasn't just going to sit back and let it happen. He had fought for people he barely knew in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. He had risked his life for missions that weren't his to question. But this was different. This was blood. This was family. This was the home where his mother had once run barefoot through the fields, where his grandfather had taught him how to hold a fishing rod, where Eleanor had rocked him to sleep on nights when the storms had been too loud. There wasn't a force on this earth that was going to take it from him. The sheriff was still sitting across from him, shifting nervously in his chair. Jason could see it in his eyes, the battle going on inside him. The man was scared. Maybe for himself, maybe for his family, maybe because he had spent the last few years looking the other way, and he was finally realizing the cost of his silence. How many men? Jason asked, his voice flat. The sheriff exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. 6. Maybe more. They're not just coming to scare you off this time, Jason. Logan wants to make an example out of you. Jason nodded, processing. 6 men, armed, probably expecting an easy target. Jason had faced worse odds. The sheriff sighed again, glancing toward the dirt road that led back to town. You still got a chance to get Eleanor out of here. Take her somewhere safe. Let this place go. Jason gave him a long, hard look. You already know that's not happening. The sheriff swallowed. Then you're going to need help. Jason tilted his head slightly. You volunteering? The man let out a bitter chuckle. Hell, Jason, you know I can't. Logan's got his hooks in everything. A step out of line, I might as well put a target on my back. And my family's. Jason clenched his jaw. So you're just going to sit back and watch? The sheriff hesitated, then stood up. I'm warning you because I owe your grandmother. But that's all I can do. He met Jason's eyes for a long moment. Good luck. And then he walked back to his cruiser and drove off, leaving Jason standing alone in the warm afternoon sun, the weight of what was coming pressing down on his chest like a loaded rifle. Eleanor stepped onto the porch a few minutes later, leaning on her cane. Let me guess, she said dryly. No cavalry coming to save us? Jason let out a slow breath. No. She gave him a knowing look. And you didn't expect one anyway, did you? He smirked, shaking his head. Not even a little. Eleanor sat down in her rocking chair, exhaling. People in this town used to fight for each other. You know, there was a time when Logan wouldn't have lasted a day before a dozen farmers ran him out of town. Jason leaned against the railing, arms crossed. What happened? Eleanor was quiet for a long time, staring out at the fields. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost sad. Fear happened. People started looking the other way when bad things happened. They told themselves it wasn't their problem, that as long as they kept their heads down, they'd be fine. And one by one, Logan picked them apart. Bought some of them. Scared the rest. She turned her gaze back to Jason. And now here we are. Jason glanced toward the town in the distance. He had seen the way people looked at him when he walked through the streets. The way their eyes had flickered with something, shame, maybe, or guilt, or just resignation. He knew what it was like to feel powerless. He had seen it in war zones, in places where the strong ruled through fear and the weak learned to accept their place. And he knew what it took to break that cycle. Someone had to stand up first. Someone had to prove that it was possible. But in this town, no one was willing to be that person. Jason wasn't going to wait for them to find their courage. He was going to show them how. As the sun began to set, Jason moved through the farm, setting up his defenses. He reinforced the doors and windows, making sure that when Logan's men came, they wouldn't have an easy way in. He rigged up tripwires in the tall grass, simple but effective, meant to slow down anyone approaching in the dark. He gathered what weapons he had: Eleanor's old shotgun, a rusted hunting rifle he found in the barn, a few knives. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had fought with less before. And then, just as he finished setting the last trap, he heard it. A car. No cars. Jason wiped his hands on his jeans and walked back to the porch, standing next to Eleanor as headlights appeared on the road leading up to the farm. Not black SUVs. Not Logan's men. Pickup trucks. Jason narrowed his eyes as the vehicles rolled to a stop and doors swung open. And then, one by one, the farmers stepped out. Ricky Carter, the old man who ran the general store. A couple of younger guys Jason didn't recognize, but who looked like they had spent their whole lives working the land. Jason crossed his arms. Didn't think you all did house calls. Ricky smirked, glancing around. Heard you were fixing for a fight. Jason raised an eyebrow. And Ricky took a deep breath. And I reckon we're tired of watching this town get stomped into the dirt. The old man from the general store nodded. We let Logan take this farm. It won't stop here. He'll keep coming. Until there's nothing left. Jason studied their faces. There were only half a dozen of them. Maybe 7 or 8 if you counted the ones still sitting in the trucks, hesitant, uncertain. They weren't soldiers. They weren't trained for this. But they had something Logan's men didn't. They had everything to lose. Jason nodded slowly. Then let's get to work. As the farmers spread out across the property, helping reinforce the defenses, Jason glanced at Eleanor. She was watching with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between pride and sadness. Guess you were wrong, he said. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. About what? Jason smiled slightly. About this town not fighting back. She let out a small, tired chuckle. Don't be too quick to celebrate, she murmured. This was the easy part, and Jason knew she was right, because the hard part was still coming. Tonight. And when it did, when Logan's men came rolling up to this farm expecting an easy victory, they were going to learn the truth. They weren't just fighting Jason Whitmore. They were fighting an entire town that had finally had enough. The night before the battle was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence Jason had learned to distrust. A silence that settled over the land like a heavy weight, pressing down on everything, suffocating the air with an unnatural stillness. He had felt it before, in places where war had turned cities into graveyards, where men lay in wait for the perfect moment to strike. It was the calm before the storm, and Jason had never been one to wait for the storm to come to him. The farm was as ready as it could be. The men who had shown up earlier, farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, had done what they could. Some had left, unwilling to risk their lives for a fight that wasn't officially theirs. Others had stayed, their faces set with a quiet kind of determination that Jason respected. They weren't soldiers, but they were men who had spent their whole lives working the land, men who understood hardship, men who had spent too long letting fear dictate their lives. Now they were choosing something else. Jason stood on the porch, watching the horizon. He could feel Eleanor's presence beside him before she spoke. "You never could sit still before a fight," she murmured, rocking slowly in her chair. Jason smirked, glancing at her. "And you never used to go to bed without locking up the house." Guess we both changed. Eleanor let out a soft chuckle, but didn't answer right away. Instead, she gazed out at the darkened fields, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of her chair. "Jason," she said after a long moment, her voice quieter now, more measured. "There's something you should know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Jason turned his head slightly, sensing the weight in her words. "What is it?" Eleanor didn't speak right away. She just exhaled, her gaze distant, lost in memories older than Jason himself. "This farm," she said finally, "isn't just a farm. It's a graveyard." Jason frowned, shifting slightly. "What do you mean?" Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, as if gathering her strength. Then she looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Your grandfather wasn't the only man I buried here." The word sent a chill down Jason's spine, not because he doubted her, but because the way she said it, so calm, so certain, meant that whatever she was about to tell him was something that had been locked away for a very long time. "I never told you about the first time someone tried to take this land from me," she continued, her voice steady. "It was a long time ago, before you were born, before your mother was even married. There was a man named Robert Henshaw. Businessman. He wanted the farm, just like Logan does now. Only back then, I didn't have anyone to fight for me." Jason stayed silent, listening. "He made offers," Eleanor said. "Big ones. The kind that would have set us up for life. But Henry and I, we weren't interested. This land wasn't just something to be sold. It was our home. It was where we raised our children. Where Henry's father and his father before him had worked the soil with their own hands." She took a slow breath. Henshaw didn't take rejection well. Jason's grip on the porch railing tightened slightly. "What did he do?" Eleanor's eyes darkened. "He sent men. One night, when Henry was away, they came to the house. They weren't interested in negotiation anymore." Jason felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't interrupt. "They thought I was just a farmer's wife," she continued. "Weak, defenseless. They thought they could scare me into giving up everything we built. But they didn't know me, Jason. They didn't know what I was willing to do to protect what was mine." She exhaled. "So I shot them." Jason stared at her. Eleanor wasn't a woman prone to exaggeration. She wasn't someone who told stories for effect. And yet she sat there in her rocking chair, looking him dead in the eye as she confessed to something he had never once suspected. "How many?" he asked quietly. "Two," she said simply. "One died on the porch. The other crawled into the woods before the light left his eyes." Jason ran a hand through his hair, processing. "And no one ever came looking for them." Eleanor's lips curled slightly. In those days, men like Henshaw didn't call the cops. They handled things in the dark. The kind of men he sent were the kind no one would miss. Her eyes flickered with something old, something Jason recognized, because he had seen it in himself. "I buried them in the field," she said. "Planted over them. Grew crops on their bones. And when Henshaw came sniffing around again, I looked him in the eye and told him that if he wanted this land, he'd have to bring a shovel. Because the last men he sent never left." Jason let out a slow breath. He didn't know what he had expected her to say, but it hadn't been this. "And he backed off?" Eleanor nodded. "Never heard from him again. Guess he realized there were easier people to steal from." Jason studied her. His grandmother. This old woman who had spent his entire life teaching him about kindness, about patience, about strength. And yet, here she was, admitting to something that most people would never have guessed. It wasn't just that she had killed. It was that she had done it without hesitation. That she had buried the evidence beneath the very soil she had continued to work, as if it were just another part of the land's history. "You think Logan's different?" Jason asked. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "I think Logan's younger, more reckless. And I think he surrounded himself with men who aren't afraid of ghosts." She exhaled, shaking her head. "But that doesn't mean they can't become ghosts." Jason leaned against the railing, crossing his arms. "Why tell me this now?" Eleanor studied him, her expression unreadable. "Because you deserve to know what kind of blood runs in your veins." Jason was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "All right." He smirked. "Yeah, because now I know what I'm fighting for." She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Henry was the same way, Thought he could solve every problem with his fists." Jason's smirk faded slightly. "It worked for you, didn't it?" Eleanor didn't answer. She just rocked slowly in her chair, staring out at the fields. The past was done. But the future was about to be written in blood. And Jason wasn't planning on losing. The night stretched on heavy with the kind of silence that made even the crickets pause. Jason sat on the porch, the weight of Eleanor's confession still settling in his chest. But there was no time to dwell on it. He could feel the storm coming, feel it in the way the wind had died, in the way the trees stood unnaturally still. Logan's men were coming. They weren't going to wait until morning. And Jason wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. The farmers who had stayed were inside, weapons in hand, faces pale but determined. Ricky sat by the window, a shotgun balanced across his knees. The old man from the general store, Charlie, had brought a bolt-action rifle that looked older than Jason but was still deadly in the right hands. There were 5 of them left in total, plus Eleanor. Jason had given them an out, had told them that they didn't have to stay, that they still had time to walk away. Not one of them had left. That meant something. Jason had spent the last few hours preparing. The tripwires were set. The floodlights had been rigged. He had mapped every inch of the land, calculated every possible approach. He knew how Logan's men would come fast, confident, expecting to scare off a handful of old-timers. They were going to get a lesson in tactical warfare instead. But there was still one thing Jason hadn't accounted for. The one thing he had spent his entire life learning to never underestimate. Betrayal. The first shot rang out from inside the house. Jason moved before the bullet even finished shattering the lamp beside him, rolling off the porch and landing in a crouch. The sound of footsteps thundered through the farmhouse, men shouting, wood splintering as doors were kicked open. Jason barely had time to process it before another gunshot tore through the night. And then, screaming. It wasn't Logan's men. It was Charlie. Jason's mind worked at lightning speed, putting the pieces together before he even reached the window. They hadn't been ambushed. They had been set up. Someone had let Logan's men in. Someone had turned on them. Jason pressed his back against the outer wall, glancing through the shattered window. Ricky was on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Two of the younger farmers were down as well, one clutching his stomach, the other slumped against the wall, unmoving. And standing in the center of the chaos, holding a gun, was the sheriff. Jason's stomach dropped. The old man had been right. Fear had killed this town, and Sheriff Calloway had sold his soul to it. Logan's men flooded the farmhouse now, moving fast, securing the rooms. Jason counted 6 of them. Calloway was talking, but Jason couldn't hear the words over the roaring in his ears. The betrayal burned like acid. He had given the sheriff a chance, and the man had led the wolves straight to Eleanor's door. Jason inhaled, forcing himself to focus. Later. There would be time for rage later. Right now, he had one priority, Eleanor. She was still inside. Jason ducked low, moving quickly, circling to the back entrance. They hadn't secured the kitchen yet. He slipped in through the side door, silent, careful, listening. The house smelled like gunpowder and blood. The floor creaked beneath his boots. He kept moving. 2 men were in the hallway, their backs turned. Jason didn't hesitate. He moved like a ghost, closing the distance in seconds. The first man didn't even see it coming. Jason grabbed his head and twisted hard. A sickening crack. The body slumped. The second man turned, eyes wide. Jason drove his elbow into the man's throat, cutting off his scream before driving a knife into his ribcage. The man crumpled, choking on his own breath. Jason exhaled. 2 down. 4 to go. Voices in the next room. Where is she? Logan's voice. Jason felt his muscles coil. Eleanor. He moved fast, pressing against the wall near the doorway. He could see them now, Logan, the sheriff, and 3 more men. Logan had a gun in one hand, but he wasn't pointing it. He was pacing, agitated. Calloway stood stiffly beside him, his face pale, sweat dripping from his forehead. Eleanor sat in her chair, unmoving. Jason's fingers tightened around his knife. He had to act now. Logan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. Damn it, Calloway, I told you this would be simple. The sheriff swallowed hard. It was simple until Whitmore showed up. Logan turned, his expression dark. Yeah, and where the hell is he? Jason answered with violence. He moved fast. One of Logan's men barely had time to react before Jason grabbed him by the collar and slammed his face into the wall. Bone crunched. The second man turned, but Jason was already there, driving a boot into his knee before snapping his neck in one fluid motion. Logan stumbled back, eyes wide with shock. The sheriff panicked, fumbling for his gun. Too slow. Jason grabbed Calloway by the wrist and twisted. The gun dropped. Calloway let out a strangled cry, but Jason didn't give him a chance to react. He threw the man to the ground, pressing his boot against his throat. Logan was the last one standing. And now he was afraid. Jason straightened, breathing hard, blood on his hands. He took a step toward Logan. The man lifted his gun, but his hands were shaking. "You're gonna kill me?" Logan rasped. Jason tilted his head. "You put a gun on my grandmother." Logan's lip curled. "She's just some old woman." "The world moves forward, Whitmore. You can't stop it." Jason's jaw tightened. "You're right." And then bang. Logan screamed, dropping his gun, clutching his shoulder. Jason had aimed for pain, not death. The sheriff choked beneath Jason's boot. "Please, please, I didn't have a choice." Jason stared down at him, feeling nothing. "You always had a choice." The sheriff had chosen wrong. Jason pressed harder. Calloway's face turned red, his hands scrambling against the floor. Then, finally, Jason stepped back, letting him gasp for breath. Eleanor exhaled from her chair, watching quietly. "Well," she muttered. "That was dramatic." Jason ignored her, turning back to Logan. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice cold. "You're going to get in your car and leave. You're going to tell your bosses that this town isn't for sale. And if you ever come back—" He knelt down beside Logan, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I will bury you under this farm, just like the last men who thought they could take it." Logan's breathing was ragged. "You think you've won," he croaked. Jason smirked. "I think you're bleeding on my grandmother's floor." Logan left. The sheriff crawled after him. Jason watched them go, knowing it wasn't over. Not yet. Logan would be back. And when he came, Jason would be waiting. The farmhouse smelled like blood and gunpowder. The bodies had been cleared, but the echoes of the fight still lingered in the air, thick and heavy, like the weight of a storm that had passed but left destruction in its wake. Jason stood by the kitchen sink, washing the blood off his hands, watching as the water ran red before swirling down the drain. His knuckles were raw, split open in places, but the pain barely registered. He had been in worse shape before. Eleanor sat at the table, wrapping a fresh bandage around her wrist. She had refused to leave the farmhouse, refused to let Jason send her away for safety. He hadn't been surprised. She was as stubborn as he was, maybe more. Across from her, Ricky sat with his head down, silent, still clutching the shotgun he had barely had time to use. The other two men, what was left of the ragtag resistance, were patching themselves up, their faces tight with exhaustion and fear. Jason dried his hands and turned to face them. "It's not over." No one responded right away. Ricky exhaled slowly. "You really think Logan's going to come back after what we did?" Jason didn't hesitate. "I know he will." The old man from the general store, Charlie, wiped his mouth with a shaking hand. "That was half his crew, Jason. You think he's just going to call it a day?" Jason shook his head. "Logan doesn't care about those men. He cares about power. And he just lost it. You think he's going to let that stand?" He glanced at Eleanor. You saw his face. He wasn't scared. He was angry. "He's not leaving it like this." Eleanor nodded grimly. "Then what's the plan?" Jason clenched his jaw. He had already thought it through 100 times. "We take the fight to him." Charlie scoffed. "What, you want to storm his compound?" Jason met his eyes. "No, I want to end this." The room fell silent. Jason grabbed the shotgun from the table, checked the chamber. "We have two options. We sit here, wait for Logan to regroup, and hope we can survive another attack. Or we finish this tonight." Ricky shifted uncomfortably. "What does that mean?" Jason exhaled. "It means we go after him before he has a chance to recover. Before he brings in more men. Before he decides burning this farm to the ground is worth the risk." Charlie shook his head. "That's suicide." Jason turned to Eleanor. "Grandma, you still got those old dynamite sticks in the barn?" She arched an eyebrow. "You mean the ones Henry stashed away back when the mine was still running?" Jason nodded. Eleanor smirked slightly. "Damn right I do." Ricky's eyes widened. "Jesus Christ, you're serious." Jason grabbed his rifle, slung it over his shoulder. "I'm done waiting for them to come to us." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple. "I should probably try and stop you." Jason smirked. "But you won't." She sighed. "No, I won't." Ricky rubbed a hand over his face. "If we do this, there's no coming back." Jason met his gaze. There was never coming back. The decision was made. The plan was simple. Logan's operation was run out of an old trucking depot on the outskirts of town. It was heavily guarded, but Jason had already studied the layout, already mapped the security patterns. He knew where the weak spots were. And now, with the element of surprise, they were going to hit Logan where it hurt. They loaded the dynamite into the truck, covered it with old grain sacks. Jason checked his weapons twice, then a third time, making sure every clip was full, every chamber loaded. He knew what he was about to do. He had spent his life dismantling enemies, taking apart operations just like Logan's in places where the rules didn't exist. This was no different. Except it was. Because this time, it was home. Eleanor watched from the porch as Jason climbed into the driver's seat. "Be careful," she said quietly. Jason met her eyes. Always. She didn't look convinced. The truck rumbled to life, and Jason, Ricky, and Charlie drove into the night. They arrived just before midnight. The depot was quiet, but Jason could see the movement. Guards patrolling, the glow of cigarettes in the dark, the distant hum of voices. Logan was in there. He had men, probably more than before. Jason didn't care. They parked a quarter-mile away, moving the dynamite on foot. Jason led the way, his steps silent, his mind already calculating. The plan was simple. Plant the explosives, get in, get Logan, get out. But plans never survived first contact. They were halfway there when Ricky froze. Shit. Jason turned. 2 guards, walking toward them. There was no time to hide, no time to run. Jason moved first. He surged forward, grabbing the nearest man by the throat and driving him into the ground. Ricky fired his shotgun, dropping the second man before he could reach for his radio. But the shot was loud. Too loud. The depot erupted. Lights snapped on. Voices shouted. Footsteps thundered. They had been spotted. Jason grabbed the dynamite. Move. They sprinted for the depot, gunfire cracking around them. Jason took cover behind a stack of shipping containers, returning fire. Ricky was beside him, breathing hard, reloading. This just got real bad, real fast. Jason smirked. That's usually how it goes. Charlie was already moving, planting the charges. Jason covered him, dropping 2 more of Logan's men as they approached. The explosions were set. 5 minutes. Then Logan's voice. "You're a dead man, Whitmore." Jason turned. Logan stood on the catwalk above them, a pistol in one hand, a radio in the other. Jason didn't hesitate. He fired. The bullet clipped Logan's leg. He staggered, cursing, but didn't fall. Instead, he laughed. "You think this is over?" Logan spat, limping. "You think you win just because you blow up a damn building?" Jason narrowed his eyes. "No." And then the explosions went off. The entire depot shook. Fire erupted, metal screeched, smoke billowed into the night. Jason grabbed Ricky and Charlie, dragging them away as the flames consumed the structure. Logan disappeared into the chaos. Jason stared at the wreckage, his jaw clenched. It wasn't over. Not yet. Logan was still alive, and Jason knew exactly where he was going. Back to the farm. Back to Eleanor. Jason turned to Ricky, his voice cold. "Drive." The fire from the depot still roared behind them, painting the night sky in streaks of orange and red, but Jason had no time to admire the destruction. The second he saw Logan disappear into the chaos, he knew exactly what was going to happen next. Logan wasn't running away. He was running towards something. And Jason only had one thought in his mind as he jumped into the truck beside Ricky, gripping the dashboard so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Eleanor." "Drive," Jason snapped. Ricky didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot in the gas, the truck fishtailing as it kicked up dirt and gravel, roaring down the back roads toward the farm. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his mind already running through worst-case scenarios. Logan was smart. Logan was vindictive. Logan didn't care about money anymore. He cared about revenge. Jason had burned his operation to the ground, and now Logan was going to try and take something from him in return. Something he couldn't replace. Jason grabbed the radio from the dashboard, static hissing as he turned the dial. Eleanor. Nothing. His grip tightened. Eleanor. Pick up the damn radio. More static. Then finally her voice. But it wasn't the voice he wanted to hear. It was shaky, uneven. And in the background, he could hear another voice. Logan. Well, Logan's voice drawled through the speaker, casual and dripping with amusement. Look who finally decided to check in. Jason's jaw clenched. If you touch her. Oh, relax, Logan said. She's fine. For now. But you really should have finished the job back there, Jason. That was sloppy. You left me alive, and now I get to return the favor. Jason forced himself to breathe. What do you want? Logan laughed. You already know. You and me. One last round. No guns. No backup. Just you, me, and a shovel. We settle this the old-fashioned way. Jason's stomach turned. A shovel. That meant a grave. Either Logan planned to bury Jason in it, or he had already dug one for Eleanor. Jason took a slow breath, forcing the anger down, forcing his mind to stay clear. Where? You already know where, Logan murmured. Back where it all started. Jason closed his eyes for half a second. The oak tree. The place where Henry was buried. The place where Eleanor had buried the last men who had tried to take her land. Logan knew. Jason didn't respond. He just threw the radio down and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. By the time they reached the farm, the front door was wide open. Jason barely waited for the truck to stop before he jumped out, gun raised, his body moving on pure instinct. The house was dark, quiet, too quiet. He moved fast, clearing the front rooms. No signs of a struggle, no signs of Eleanor. His chest tightened, and then he heard it. A shovel striking dirt. Jason turned toward the sound. The oak tree. He sprinted. As he rounded the corner of the house, the sight made his blood run cold. Logan was standing next to a freshly dug grave, and beside him, Eleanor on her knees, hands tied, staring up at Jason without a single trace of fear in her eyes. Jason stopped just a few feet away, his breath coming hard, his mind calculating every possible way this could play out. Logan was holding a gun, but not aimed at Eleanor. He was gripping the shovel instead, driving it into the ground one more time before tossing it aside, wiping sweat off his forehead. Funny thing, Logan mused. I didn't even have to dig this one. It was already here. Jason's heart pounded. Let her go. Logan smirked. You keep saying that like you're in control here. Jason clenched his fists. You wanted a fight. Here I am. Logan nodded approvingly. That's what I like about you, Whitmore. You've got that old world honor. Just like your granddaddy. He tilted his head toward Eleanor. She tell you yet? Jason frowned. Tell me what? Logan grinned, his teeth flashing white in the moonlight. This grave? This isn't Henry's. Henry's over there. He gestured toward the real headstone. No, this one, he tapped the dirt with his boot. This one belongs to the last bastard who tried to take this farm from her. Jason stayed quiet. Logan's smile widened. Yeah, that's right. See, I did some digging of my own, literally. This grave? It was shallow. Too shallow. He let out a mock sigh. I mean, I get it. Eleanor wasn't a professional. She panicked. Didn't want the body found, so she buried it fast. Didn't even bother to get rid of the bones properly. He laughed. And here you are, defending her like she's some sweet old lady, when really, she's just like me. Jason's hands curled into fists. He wasn't angry at Eleanor. He was angry at himself for not seeing this coming. Logan took a step closer. Here's the deal, Whitmore. We both know I'm not walking away from this unless one of us is in that hole. He pulled out his knife, flipping it casually. So let's settle it. No guns. No backup. You and me. Last man standing. Jason didn't hesitate. He dropped his gun. Logan's grin widened. That's the spirit. And then he lunged. Jason sidestepped the first attack, his training kicking in immediately. Logan wasn't untrained. He was fast, strong, and mean, but Jason had spent years learning how to dismantle men exactly like him. Logan came at him with a wild swing, but Jason ducked, driving his elbow into Logan's ribs. The other man grunted, stumbling back, but he recovered fast. Logan tackled Jason, sending both of them crashing into the dirt. Jason twisted, striking Logan's throat before rolling away, but Logan was already back on his feet. They circled each other, breathing hard. You can't protect her forever, Logan sneered. Jason's expression didn't change. I don't need to. Logan lunged again. This time, Jason didn't dodge. He let Logan get close. And then he used Logan's own momentum against him. Jason caught his wrist, twisted hard, and forced the knife from Logan's grip. It hit the dirt. Logan swung blindly, but Jason grabbed him by the collar and drove his knee into Logan's face. Logan hit the ground. Hard. Jason was on him in an instant, pinning him down. One punch, then another. Logan's nose cracked. Blood spattered the dirt. Logan coughed, wheezing. Go on. Do it. Jason didn't move. He could end it. Right now. But then Eleanor's voice. Jason. He looked up. Eleanor stared at him, her face unreadable. He's not worth it. Jason clenched his jaw. She was right. Slowly, he let go. Logan lay there, gasping, bleeding. Jason exhaled. It was over. And then a gunshot. Jason spun. The sheriff stood at the edge of the clearing, gun raised, smoke curling from barrel. Jason's stomach twisted. Logan was dead. Calloway lowered the gun, his face pale. No loose end, he muttered. Jason stared at him. Because for the first time, he realized Logan was never the real problem. The real enemy had been standing beside them all along. The night air felt heavier now, thick with smoke, sweat, and something even darker, finality. Logan's body lay in the dirt, his lifeless eyes reflecting the cold silver glow of the moon. The gunshot that had ended his life still echoed in Jason's ears, a brutal punctuation to a battle he expected to fight with his own hands. But it hadn't been his choice. The bullet hadn't come from him. It had come from Sheriff Calloway. The older man stood at the edge of the clearing, his revolver still smoking, his grip steady despite the paleness of his face. Jason watched him, his body still coiled tight, his blood still humming from the fight, but his instincts told him that whatever this was, it wasn't over. Eleanor remained on her knees beside the shallow grave, her hands still tied, her expression blank. For the first time in all of this, she didn't look like the unshakable matriarch who had faced down death with nothing but stubborn pride. She just looked tired. Calloway exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, he muttered. That's done. Jason didn't move, didn't speak. He was watching, calculating. Calloway had played this entire situation like a man with nothing to lose, but something about his posture, about the way his gun still hovered near his hip, told Jason that he wasn't finished yet. Why? Jason finally asked, his voice calm but laced with something sharp. Calloway looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a second, just a second, Jason saw something in his eyes. Guilt. But it was gone just as fast. Because it had to be done, Calloway said. Logan was a problem. A big one. He would have come back, kept pushing, kept bleeding this town dry. You were never going to kill him, Jason. He gestured vaguely toward the body. So I did it for you. Jason took a slow step forward. Bullshit. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. Damn shame. I was hoping you'd be smart enough to let it go. Jason's stomach turned cold. That was it. The tell. The truth slid into place in Jason's mind like a gun cocking back. Logan had never been the top of the food chain. Calloway had. Jason exhaled slowly, feeling his pulse steady as clarity settled in. This was never about Logan, was it? Calloway tilted his head. You just now figuring that out? Jason's fingers curled into fists. Logan had been ruthless, but he had been small time. Just another arrogant enforcer trying to play king. But Calloway? He had played both sides from the start. The sheriff sighed, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a long day's work. See, Logan was good at what he did, bullying, threatening, making people fall in line. But he wasn't the one who actually ran this town. He gestured loosely at himself. That was me. Jason's jaw clenched. I let Logan believe he was in charge, Calloway continued. It kept him happy, kept him from asking too many questions. But when you started making waves, when you burned down that depot, when you forced his hand, well, you made things messy. And messy means attention. He shrugged. So I had to clean up. Jason took another step forward, but Calloway lifted his gun slightly, stopping him in his tracks. I like you, Whitmore, Calloway said. Always have. You're a fighter. You're loyal. And you're damn good at what you do. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. That's why I'm giving you an option. Jason's body remained perfectly still, but inside, his muscles coiled, ready. I'm listening. Calloway's eyes darkened. You leave tonight. You take your grandmother, you take your little group of farm boys, and you walk away. You let me handle what's left. And in return, he lifted the revolver slightly, angling it toward Eleanor. I let her live. Jason's vision tunneled. Eleanor didn't flinch. Of course she didn't. Jason's breathing slowed. His heart rate dropped into something steady, something lethal. He had spent his life making choices. Some easy, some impossible. But this one wasn't hard at all. I have a counteroffer, Jason said. Calloway raised an eyebrow. Oh. Jason moved. Faster than Calloway had expected. He closed the distance in a split second, grabbing Calloway's wrist and twisting hard. The sheriff grunted in pain, the revolver clattering to the ground, and before he could react, Jason drove his knee into Calloway's gut. The older man stumbled back, coughing, but Jason didn't give him time to recover. He grabbed Calloway by the collar and threw him against the oak tree, his forearm pressing into the sheriff's throat. Calloway gasped, struggling, but Jason was stronger. You had your chance, Jason said, voice dangerously calm. Calloway wheezed, clawing at Jason's arm. You don't want to do this. Jason leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. You threatened my grandmother. Calloway's eyes widened. For the first time, he looked afraid. Jason had spent years delivering justice in the shadows, and Calloway had just crossed a line. Jason didn't say another word. He stepped back, grabbed the revolver off the ground, and shot Calloway once in the knee. The sheriff screamed, collapsing to the dirt, clutching his leg. Jason crouched beside him, spinning the revolver in his hand. "I could kill you," he said conversationally. Calloway panted, sweat dripping down his face. "Then do it." Jason smirked. "No." Calloway blinked, confused. Jason gestured toward Logan's lifeless body. "Because you're going to clean up your own damn mess." Calloway's face twisted. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jason stood, towering over him. "You're going to call your men. You're going to tell them that Logan's dead, that you handled it, that it's over." He crouched back down, lowering his voice. "And then you're going to resign." Calloway laughed bitterly. "You think I can just walk away from this?" Jason smiled coldly. "I don't give a damn what you do. But if you ever come near my grandmother again, bury you next to Logan." Calloway saw it then. Jason wasn't bluffing. He swallowed hard and nodded. Jason stepped back. It was over. Eleanor exhaled. "Well," she muttered, shaking her head. "That was dramatic." Jason chuckled, helping her to her feet. "Let's go home." She patted his cheek. "You are home, boy." And for the first time in a long time, Jason believed it.